All right, we're back. Okay, I've got you guys back. Okay, so this is what I wrote. This is all I wrote. I didn't write anything else. So if we're going to measure pain reduction, or pain, we're going to say there's been pain reduction. Let's say 30%, it turns out 30% of subjects, even though they received no active ingredient, they say they feel better. Well, how could this happen? Well, either they just feel better because they've been doing something, they believe they've been doing something proactive, they're part of an experiment to try and reduce their painful migraine experience, and they're getting attention from the study trial nurses, and they they get a gift certificate for participating. They get to go to they get a gift certificate to go to a restaurant and for their participation as a reward. So they just feel, they think they're doing better, right? They feel better. And that could happen. It also could happen that they actually do take actions now that they're part of a trial. They start doing research. They read about reduction, mitigating migraine symptoms. They get into a yoga class, or they decide to eat less triggering foods, or they prevent a full-on migraine by identifying triggers and resting to avoid a migraine, or turning lights out. All these possible triggers for people who suffer migraines. So that could also be the reason that there's an effect when there's nothing really being done to them. So both of those are mentioned here in the notes. One is called the placebo effect, where human subjects in the control group of an experiment experience an effect because of their belief in the positive outcome of the treatment. So just their belief, the human body is incredible. Our beliefs can affect us at a physical level, at a microscopic level, I don't know what to call it, at a biological level or degree. Okay, we can actually, by our sheer joy, that can release endorphins that are pain-reducing chemicals in our body. Okay, so our general sense of well-being can just be going up because we're feeling positive. There's also something called or recognized as the nocebo effect. If you're pessimistic, you could actually affect results just being more complaining, or because you're paying greater attention to your discomfort, you just feel uncomfortable. You don't feel well. And you're just noticing things more. You're noticing aches and pains more. Okay, so those are the kind of effects that the control group is controlling against. And I'll explain in the diagram what I mean by that in a second. I just wanted to differentiate between the placebo effect or nocebo effect and the Hawthorne effect. Hawthorne effect is what's mentioned in the video. This is where, and I just mentioned it just earlier, that this is where human subjects in the control group of experiments experience an effect because their behavior changes to favor a particular outcome. So they start, like I mentioned in this trial, as a result of being in the trial, they start reading more, research, and finding out how they can mitigate their symptoms. And so they've taken positive actions and affected their outcomes, not because of the treatment, because they are not really getting anything medical, but they have affected the outcome of interest, pain, and pain reduction. Again, this is what's described in the video, but not by name. So because of those two realities with human subjects, a control group is established, and this provides a baseline from over and above which the treatment group has to supersede. So for a drug to be considered effective, the treatment group has to do better. What better exactly means, we'll talk about that more towards the end of the course, but this is where we want to get. We want to see if there's a significant difference, and what we say is statistically significant difference between the outcome of the control group and the outcome of the treatment group. So this is about, let's say here, 50%. So because we've enrolled enough subjects in our study, enough individuals, patients, the people over here in the control group should look like, they should have the same sort of variation or pattern of characteristics related to migraine outcomes, health outcomes, or levels of pain as the people in this treatment group. So factors determining their sense of well-being or their levels of pain should not be influenced by the characteristics of the group. It should only be influenced by the treatment. So we make sure that there's just as many unhealthy people as healthy people in the control group as the treatment group. And we do this by having enough people in either group so that the variation can present itself. And we don't assign people to the groups in a systematic way. We assign them, or a biasing way, we assign them in a randomized way. Any questions? So that's what RCT is, randomized controlled trial. Okay. So that's that. All right, so then throughout the notes, I reference the video and I ask questions. I'm going to use my annotated notes. The annotated notes are the ones with my answers on them, so we can maybe breeze through this. So you have access to this file as well. So I ask you, and make the statement, an experiment deliberately imposes some treatment on an individual in order to observe their responses. And I ask the question, an example in the video is what? What did you put here, or did you just read my annotated notes? Some examples include the ink in the lobster tank, the physician health study with the aspirin, and experiments with putting tar on rats and seeing the outcome of that carcinogen in killing those rats. In fact, that's what the studies were for. Anybody write anything else? In an observational study, in contrast, those would be like surveys, census, or focus group studies. Observational studies are where you observe individuals and measure variables of interest, but do not otherwise attempt to influence their responses. And some examples in the video was just where the experimenter, or the research scientist was observing lobsters. The General Social Survey of the NORC, and there was a discussion about the census of the homeless. Anybody write anything else, or think of anything else to put there? There are two types of observational studies mentioned in the video. Retrospective studies that use data from the past, while prospective studies follow subjects for a number of years from the start of a study. Now these two approaches have their benefits and limitations. Okay, so all research has limitations. As long as you state them outright, they can help anyone reading or looking at your research to determine how meaningful or generalizable your findings are. Okay, so this is where students often ask questions. This discussion of bias. A survey or experimental design is biased if it systematically favors certain outcomes. So the example of people who are selecting themselves to be part of an experiment, that's going to be problematic, right? They can volunteer, but they need to be assigned to treatment or control groups if they're human subjects. So you want to be careful not to introduce systematic bias that favors either outcomes of interest. We say a result is biased upward if the result is more, greater, or higher than is actually the case. And I asked for some examples in the video, and I presented them here. There was the poll that predicted that A.E. Landon would beat FDR. That result was biased upward toward people who could afford cars and telephones so they could receive and respond to the surveys. There was the case of Ann Lander's voluntary response survey asking if people would have kids again, and the overwhelming response was no. That was biased towards people who were unhappy with their children. And it showed 70% said they would not have children again. So angry, frustrated, disgruntled people would respond to that survey as opposed to asking people who don't have a biased opinion about that either way and seeing what they would have to say. A finding is biased downward, on the other hand, if the result is less, smaller, lower than actually is the case. An example in the video would be the census of the number of people in the US is downward biased. So the results of a census would be biased against minorities that might be undercounted. They might be hard to reach. They might not have a registered, well, they might not be documented. They might not have registered addresses. They might not have cell phone information for how they can be reached, or telephones that they can be reached at. The Ann Lander survey is another example about enjoying sex after marriage. This was biased downward. Only 18% of respondents said that they did enjoy. And that, again, similar to the results for the voluntary response to the kids survey, people who are unhappy are responding in greater propensity than people who are content, who are not complaining or want to be heard. Okay, so that's that discussion. Did anybody put anything else there or have any comments about that? So where does data come from? Data can come from as a result of experimentation, where we look at fertilizer treatments on yields of plants. We can talk about experiments like drug therapies, vaccines, etc. Experimentation is conducted to develop evidence to support a causal link between an explanatory variable and a response variable. So, explanatory variable explains the response in that sense. We're looking for that link. So conducting a good experiment controls for the effect of influential factors other than your explanatory variable to establish a clear relationship between the explanatory variable and the response variable. The idea is to intervene with or treat a subject and measure how it or she or he responds. This arises more frequently in the physical or pure sciences than in the social sciences. This is actually conducting the experiment. It's very important. Don't rely on what looks good. You can run into problems. When experiment is not pure, responses can be confounded or confused by overlooked variables, which can play an important role. Random is not haphazard. So this is like a review of things I've been saying and you've seen in the video. Experimental design must be careful not to introduce bias. So I asked for an example of an experiment in the video that's different from the one above, and I just mentioned the theoretical experiment where they talk about how you can know whether smoking causes cancer by separating newborns at birth and exposing one group randomly you could select them and put them into two groups, and one group would never be exposed to cigarette smoke and the other group would be, and you would check longitudinally or prospectively how they perform or how they do on a number of variables measured for their health, in particular whether they're alive after 30 years or not. There are two key differences between designing experiments and designing surveys, and I mentioned them here, and they might not be so clear. I want to make it clear. Well, the obvious difference is that in experiments, a treatment is imposed, but in surveys, the subjects are not otherwise interfered with. But it's important to note the randomization process for surveys and experiments. If you saw the video, then you saw that we begin with a list of individuals, and we number those individuals. We number them. So let's say this was our list. Okay, and then we start numbering them. Depending on how many there are, if there's less than 10, you can use single digits. If there's, let's say, up to 25, you would have to use 2 digits. So we would put a 0 in front here as a place mark, because all of the labels have to have the same length. These all have a length of 2. Now, if these are subjects for a survey, I might just take the number of participants I need for the survey. So randomly selecting them, as discussed in or explained in the video, or maybe you've seen this before, you can use a random digits table, or you can use numbers pulled out of a hat where you have slips of paper and you've written these different numbers on them and put just one slip per number into a hat and start picking. You pick 8 out, and those 8 subjects, for instance, would be in your survey. So in this case, surveys, randomization selects participants in the survey. You might not use all of the people, right? However, in experiments, all eligible participants are used. Randomization is not used to select them into the experiment, but it's used to assign them to treatment or control groups. If for human subjects, that would be the case. So if these were my volunteers in an experiment, I want to use all of them because it's very difficult to get volunteers. It takes a while. And you want to use everyone that you can, as long as they pass a screening that's not going to be dangerous for them, they're in general good health, or they're sick enough to be in the study, but they're not too fragile to succumb or get deathly ill from being part of the trial. All right, so that's my point about the difference in randomization between survey and experiment. Questions? So I want to take a moment to talk about what lurking variables are, and I refer to the example in the video. A lurking variable is a variable that has an important effect on the relationship among variables in the study, but is not included among the variables studied. So the observation was made that when, okay, let me make this bigger. Oops, that didn't work. So this might be confusing at first glance. Let me just take pieces at a time. So it's been observed that when ice cream sales are higher, the number of drownings on a beach are also higher. Does this mean that ice cream makes people drown? Well, I'm studying ice cream sales. Let's say I have information on sales. I have information because I know the person in charge of ice cream sales at the beach. And I also have information on drownings, and I have that historical information because I work in the municipality and we keep a record of that information. And I'm really interested in this phenomenon because I want to reduce the number of drownings. So is this just a coincidence, or is there a relationship here? That's the question. If I just look at ice cream sales and drownings, if I have the ice cream salesman report to me, or woman report to me hourly about the ice cream sales, and if I see that they're increasing, I could be concerned that there's going to be more drownings on the beach and contact the municipality and have maybe some lifeguard or some municipal worker out there, the police, or maybe a paramedic or nursing staff nearby to be alerted that we're at risk of drownings. Okay, so I could use that information to help inform or prepare me for the undesirable event of people drowning. And to prevent them from dying of drowning, I would put additional staff at the beach. But does ice cream cause people to drown? No, that's not what's happening. So this is an association that's important. Actually, let me put it up here. No, this is an association, not a causal relationship. So what's really happening is there are variables that I'm not looking at that are motivating, if I just look at these, that are motivating both ice cream sales and drownings in the same way. So it could be the case that temperature is increasing. That's increasing the ice cream sales, but a temperature increase could also be associated with drowning because temperature increases the number of people on the beach. So it's hotter, people don't want to be inside. They go to the beach that day, they take a day off, or they quit work, they stop work early or studying early, and they go to the beach. And this increases the beach population and makes the total number of drownings more likely. So these variables that I'm not studying, if I'm just looking at ice cream sales and drowning, these are known as lurking variables. They're behind what I'm actually looking at. Once I introduce either of those, so rather than speak to the ice cream sales people on the beach, what if I just record the temperature? If I just monitor the temperature and use that to predict the number of drownings. So as the temperature goes up, I'll have to monitor that and let people know that we need more staff or support or human resources at the beach. Alternatively, I could monitor beach population. It's probably easier to monitor temperature, and that's why that variable might be included in a future study or in future management, beach management and planning. Once it gets used in my study or in any kind of observational way, it's no longer called a lurking variable. It would become a forefront or explanatory variable of any study. Okay, so lurking variables are ones that are left out of consideration, or maybe you can't even name them. We use this as a term to capture that notion that there's something happening behind the scenes that we don't really know. So an example of a lurking variable in the video was temperature and beach population, explaining the correlation between ice cream and drownings. Another example was where they talked about smoking causing cancer and not knowing exactly what, or suggesting the suggestions of the tobacco industry that we don't really know the cause. There might be other variables that are genetic factors responsible and has nothing to do with cigarettes per se. All right. Okay, let's see if we can do another 10 or 15 minutes. Any questions? So I make a note here that the main reason that rats and rodents are used in experimental trials in place of humans is that they metabolize substances like humans, or alternately, their biochemistry is like that of humans, so that we can draw inferences from findings and say that this would be outcome in humans. They have a shorter lifespan, and we can see those outcomes sooner. I didn't say that, did I? So rodents that are used in studies, another reason they're used is I don't think people have a particular affinity to rats and rodents. Guinea pigs would be different. They're used as pets, but rats are not pets, right? People don't really care for rats, so they get a bad rap, and they're used in experiments. There's people who fight against using animals in experiments, in particular for cosmetics, actually, and there's some countries that have outlawed the use of animals for testing cosmetics. And there's another thing to say about using rodents. So it's been determined, so let me tell you this, that these rats or rodents that are used in experiments are not just collected arbitrarily or haphazardly in nature. They're actually created They are a product of the scientific or the medical industry, medical and even agri-food industry. They are produced genetically in a certain way. They can be produced to have certain genetic defects, so they could be more prone to cancer, and then products can be tested on them in medical research. It turns out, and this is really interesting, that in recent years it's been discovered that those rodents being used in experiments are more resilient. They live longer and are more resilient against all these treatments they're undergoing. They actually are more likely to survive, and this has untold implications for research findings from research conducted on these rodents, because it would imply that, they're less susceptible to adverse events. And so we'd be missing those adverse events if we say that, the rats did okay under this treatment. Humans should do okay. Well, the average rat is not the average rat in society at large. The rats in experiments are more biased towards resilience and survival than the norm. So this is really interesting, something that I came across in the last year. Very interesting finding. This presents challenges to research. So their attempt to make all the rats the same, having the same genetic defects or having the same level of health, to conduct experiments on them, backfired. It's quite amazing, if it wasn't so horrifying. So if you're interested in that research, I don't know, I don't even have a reference at this point. I would just say, well, let me know, and I can share that research. I should actually consider putting that. I'm going to make a note to put that on the website or in the Moodle page. Okay. Okay, so that I spent some time talking about experiments. What about sampling? What are the ideas behind sampling? So examples of samples are surveys, are opinion polls, labor market activity surveys, etc. Sampling is conducted when we want to measure certain characteristics in a population or a target population. So, for instance, the proportion of people who favor the Democrats, or the proportion of defective ball bearings on a circuit board, or average disposable income in a region. What are the ideas around sampling? It is usually the case that the entire population cannot be sampled, okay? So a census is not possible since it's prohibitively expensive to do it properly, or it's just impossible to sample every subject, whether human or otherwise. A sample collects observable data in a random fashion when funds are limited, or it's prohibitively, it's impossible to get a census. This is better than an incomplete coverage of census data. If sampled properly, the sample is representative of the entire population anyways, and in a cost-effective way, we're going to have very good estimates of our parameters. We study our sample in the hope that it will tell us about the greater population. The greater the size of the sample, the better, but that makes it more expensive. And if it doesn't improve things too much, what's the point of spending that extra money, okay? So I make some key points here. And the key is to be careful not to introduce a bias in your sample. So what's some examples of census in the video? The US Census, which took place last year, and attempts to include the homeless in that census. An example of a survey in the video, I mentioned already the National Opinion Research Council surveys and the US Census Bureau surveys. I've done research with the US Census Bureau surveys. They're quite elaborate, excellent surveys. Millions a year are spent gathering that data, and I don't know that so much is done with the data analytics there, or at least it's not published. Maybe other things are done with it, but it's not as readily published as you'd think. I actually, for my PhD thesis, I used US Census Bureau data. It was very transparent. I really enjoy United States research for that reason. Data is readily available and freely available. Is freely a word? It's free, is what I want to say. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. So tomorrow I'm going to finish these notes. I've broken into these notes. I'm going to finish these notes in Unit 1 and then leave you to work on the homework. You should be practicing the homework before next class, and I'm going to finish my review of the notes and take any questions you have about Unit 1. But otherwise, I will move on to Unit 2 as soon as possible. So if you have any questions about having the calculator, I'm going to use the calculator that I mentioned, the BA2 Plus Texas Instrument calculator, but I'll also use Excel for people who want to see the computations in Excel. But I do think, I stress, it's important to get a calculator, much easier. And if you can, just get a smartphone or a version of it. So for tomorrow, hopefully we can get to Unit 2, because it's going to be Wednesday. And yeah, we want to get through Unit 2. We're going to need Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Anyway, we'll do our best to get everything done before Saturday. So the TI BA2 Plus for tomorrow. You want a calculator that conducts 2-variable statistics. And with that, I say good night, unless you have any questions. We'll pick up here tomorrow. You can read ahead in the notes and have questions for me tomorrow. If you feel that you're ready, you can try the quizzes online as well. Any questions for me?
Buenas noches.